Good afternoon and welcome to the Florida Association of Counties 2024 Legislative Wrap-Up. I'm Jeff Scala.
I'm Bob McKay.
And we're here in Tallahassee at our Studio 67 to give you a recap of the 2024 legislative session. We got a lot of bills to cover today, a lot of preemption bills, things from our legislative action plan to highlight, so we're going to get right to it. This session, there were over 1,900 bills filed and 325 bills passed this session. That comes out to roughly 17% of the bills.
And over 450 that we as FAC staff tracked and worked during the process.
That's right, and there was about 100 preemption bills, and up until the hanky dropped just last Friday, we were tracking, helping work those bills. So let's get right to it in our legislative action plan. The legislative action plan, of course, it comes from our policy conference and our legislative conference. These are the policies that the commissioners and staff bring forward to our process,
that we then have to carry up to the Hill and try and get passed. And this year was quite a successful year in terms of getting things done in our legislative action plan.
From that legislative action plan, there were 8 bills that got across the finish line, including that public records bill for county attorneys, the rural county waiver of match for the regional rural development grant program.
Yes, and also there were provisions put in for any governmental contract for anti-human trafficking, another provision that was in our health, safety, and justice program. Also in our finance, tax, administration were the continuing contracts provisions. There was a bill that increased continuing contracts from $4 million to $7.5 million, and also provided for a CPI indexing going forward so that we won't have to come back again to try and get those levels increased.
Another bill that got across the finish line was on the PACE program, Senate Bill 770. This clarifies that any PACE program has to be authorized by ordinance for a county within the jurisdiction for that PACE program to operate.
Another bill that passed, part of our program, was the affordable housing expanded utilization of tourist development taxes for Monroe County. It was a very narrow provision dealing with a surplus amount of funds that Monroe County had available, and they were able to get that authorized to use those dollars for affordable housing.
Senate Bill 1638, funding for environmental management, sets up a process for funding environmental programs using the Indian Gaming Compact dollars. Programs will be funded for land conservation and water quality. And the last bill from our program that got across the finish line was on occupational licensing. The preemption that would have gone into effect this summer was kicked out one more year, so there's another attempt for the Construction Industry Licensing Board and the legislature to provide for the specialty contract licensing at the local level. But first, Bob, let's go through some of those preemption bills that didn't get across the finish line, some that we spent a lot of time, a lot of efforts from commissioners coming up to Tallahassee, and there's nowhere better to start than county commissioner term limits, which ultimately did not pass.
What a year it was on term limits. The bills, first, starting with the House bill, because there's a lot of process things that happened this year on these bills, so it's important to go through them. On the House side, first, it was filed as a constitutional amendment. Then, that was withdrawn and filed as a general bill. The initial bill that was filed was a straight-up 8-year term limits for all counties, without regard to whether they were charter county, non-charter county, had term limits, didn't have term limits, had 12-year term limits. It was going to be 8 on everyone. Senate bill was filed the same way. Then the Senate bill, in its second committee hearing, got amended to provide for a referendum for the 3 counties that have 12-year term limits, Broward, Polk, and Lee County. The House, meanwhile, moved in an opposite direction. In order to get the bill heard, the sponsor amended it to be 12-year term limits.
So there was a little bit of gamesmanship going on throughout the process, the bill kind of wavering one way, back to the other.
Moved apart. House bill in its last committee was amended back to 8-year term limits. It still provided for a referendum approval for the 3 counties that have 12, but everyone else, whether they were a non-charter county or a charter county without term limits, all had 8 years imposed by the state. And that was the final form of the bill in the House, as it was never heard again after that State Affairs Committee, where it got amended back towards that direction. Now, in the Senate Second Committee, it was actually amended to look exactly like that final version in the House. And then that bill went on an odyssey. It took 3 hearings to get it out of Senate rules. That bill was temporarily postponed twice, Jeff, in rules. That seldom happens, and the bill made it out.
Rarely happens, and that was due to a lot of the testimony from our county commissioners, from small counties, from larger counties, that really hit home that the right of the people to make this decision either through a charter or through a vote of the people need not be told by Tallahassee how to make this decision.
And we wouldn't be telling the story right if we didn't let you know that your executive committee, your past presidents, Commissioners Thomas, Commissioner Bryant, all came up to testify. It was a great showing from FAC leadership. In that Rules Committee, the second time it was temporarily postponed, the bill was amended to the point where there were 5 different groups of counties that were all being treated differently with respect to term limits. At that moment, it looked like old-time Senate. One senator got up, walked around the room, talked to senators, basically counting votes, and then came back and asked the bill to be TP'd, which it was. The bill came up for a third time. At this point in time, the bill was now postured with another amendment that would allow everyone to go to a referendum to decide whether they wanted to have no term limits, keep existing term limits if they're a charter county with 12, or not have term limits at all. And so ultimately the bill did pass out of committee, but was never heard on the floor. And that was the last we heard of the bill.
That was the last we heard of the bill for this year. We do expect the bill to come back next year, as many bills do when they fail. So we'll be vigilant in the interim period. But for this legislative session and for this upcoming election in November, county commissioner term limits will not be on the ballot. Another perennial, issue, Bob, that we hear year in, year out on reform for sovereign immunity and the caps. That bill didn't get across the finish line, but tell us kind of its journey through the process this year.
Yes, this year the caps were much more reasonable than the caps they proposed last year in particular. This year the caps were proposed to increase from 200, 300 to 300, 500. But the caps did not move. There was also conversation about 400, 600 at times, but ultimately in its last committee on the House side, a poison pill was put on that left the actual proponents, the trial bar, not interested in passing their own bill. It did come back and make it through Senate rules on the Senate side to the Senate floor. It was on the calendar for the last couple of days, but ultimately it was removed from the calendar and the bill was not heard again.
Thank you, Bob. And of course, every year we get the laundry list of preemptions. Like we said, we were tracking about 100 preemption bills this year. Bob, start us off with a few of those that just didn't make it this year.
One of those was the county budget officers. This was a bill that would have taken the county chief budget person out from under the executive part of the county, whether it be a manager system, coordinator system, and place them directly under the board. That did not pass. There was also one dealing with local business taxes. Local business taxes, the bill would have repealed, eliminated all the local business taxes. That was the early version. Later version of the bill was going to freeze the revenues and reduce the rates. And so neither of those bills passed. The Senate bill never saw any movement. It was never heard in committee. The House bill did make it sufficient distance through the process, but ultimately did not pass.
And just like last year, there were preemptions on dredge and fill for wetlands preemption, never got heard. Things like fertilizer ordinances, while they were tucked into the budget last year, they didn't pop up at all this session. The legislature tried preempting local governments on monuments, on agritourism, on soil and water board dissolution and realignment. Those ideas didn't get across the finish line. Enhanced firearm training facility zoning. The reemption of the regulation of auxiliary containers or plastic containers.
And a reemption is when they double down on an existing preemption.
Yeah, meaning plastics are already preempted to the state. They were trying to go a step further and say they're really preempted to the state and brought in what plastic containers we were speaking of. And then even, very broad preemptions on artificial intelligence systems and even the display of governmental flags at your county-owned properties. So again, a lot of preemption bills that failed this session, But of course, there are bills that we work on every year. There are preemptions that do get across the finish line. One that we'll start with here, House Bill 433, did pass. It didn't pass in the way that it was originally filed. There was a bit of a dance between the House and Senate on what provisions would be included. The Senate version mainly included the heat exposure requirement preemption for workplace heat exposure requirements, while the House bill included much broader based preemptions on minimum wage and the terms and conditions of employment. Bob, can you tell us more about what that really meant, the terms and conditions of employment and minimum wage?
Sure. First, on the minimum wage, it's important to understand that local governments were already preempted for any wage requirements related to the private sector, with 2 exceptions. There's 3 exceptions, period, for local governments with respect to the preemption on wage. One is for our own employees, which does not affect the private sector. The second is for anyone we provide tax subsidies to. And the third is for anyone that contracts with us. It was that third authority that they took away in House Bill 433. Now, they did kick it out a couple years that we can continue to contract, and no contract entered into before July 1, 2026 will be impaired by the legislation. But after that, we would lose the ability to require increased wage and higher than the minimum wage, or increased benefits, any employee benefits, as part of our contracting. Now, the middle part of the bill, the other preemption that dealt with terms and conditions of employment, it was an extremely broad preemption. It was never in the Senate bill, it was only in the House. The House did end up picking up the Senate bill, but the early versions of the bill didn't even exempt our own employees. So you could not specify any term and condition that wasn't expressly authorized in state or federal law, even with respect to your own employees. There was an amendment put on in the House that the League of Cities supported. We did not, because it narrowly added employee benefits. But many other things to employment situations with our own employees were not covered. Scheduling, advancement, classification, certain discrimination protections, other things were all preempted with respect to our own employees. What happened on day 59, second to last day of the session, the House took away the broad language and put in a specific list that included about 8 things we were specifically preempted on unemployment. And Bob, included...
That's where things got interesting, right?
Yes, they did. Because one of the words they put in that we were preempted on was attire. We were very successful at pointing out to the Senate, once the House passed it entirely, that local ordinances dealing with adult entertainment require employees have certain attire, as small as it might be, covering certain sensitive body parts. And so
that's when we got to explain to the legislature, particularly the Senate, since the House had already voted on that provision, we the FAC policy team, had to storm the Capitol, for lack of a better word, and tell the senators what that implication of including the word attire, including in the bill.
The ultimate outcome was, first we delayed sine die by about 2 hours because of this. We had to make 2 bills bounce again back from the Senate over to the House, where they would not have happened previously. Actually, one to the from the Senate to the House, one from the House to the Senate. And but instead of the long list of things that we're preempted on, we are only preempted on scheduling, and this is employee scheduling for private employers, including predictive scheduling. So all the other things on the list fell by the wayside due to our efforts on that last day.
Sticking kind of with this theme, another preemption bill as it relates to minimum wage or prevailing wage was House Bill 705 on public works. This bill, it's an issue that we've worked on 4 times over the last 8 years. There's been a bill passed, and it's a definition change to what a public works project is. And in the past, public works projects were defined as those projects we're talking about road projects and water projects that use exclusively state dollars. So, in particular, when you have a local grant that has federal dollars, there are federal strings that you have to follow federal rules. When there were state dollars, we had to follow state rules. However, the law was that when there were exclusively local dollars, we could use local preferences in our contracting for those programs. So that would impact wages, staffing levels, other benefits that we could provide.
And it's important to understand, as an economist, that keeps those dollars local, so that local tax dollars are being spent in the local community to enhance that community and stay and multiply in that community.
And that's right, Bob. And unfortunately, this year, those words local or, which would bring in when local dollars are used, were added to the definition, thereby preempting local preferences as it relates to public works projects. There was a few amendments. There were a few amendments in there that said that we could use geographic preferences. So if there were small businesses that wanted to apply, or you could have requirements for businesses to be located in your geographic area. But ultimately, House Bill 705 did pass along with 433's wage preemption. So this was a theme this session for the legislature. Moving along, Senate Bill 1628. This is local government actions. Last year, we all talked about the business impact statement bill, where when local governments passed certain ordinances, they had to provide a business impact statement when, if so needed. This bill walked back one of the exemption categories, which was any local ordinance dealing with Chapter 163, Part 2, dealing with growth management issues like changes to the Land Development Code, development orders. So Senate Bill 1628 started off saying that we needed to do that business impact statement. But what else did it include, Bob, initially?
Well, it did include the part we'd have to do a business impact statement on those types of changes. But additionally, it also, another part of the business impact bill last year, Senate Bill 170 from 2023, was the ability for people to sue if they felt that an ordinance was arbitrary or unreasonable or already preempted to the state. And so this would have opened up the ability for anyone in the community to file a lawsuit based upon comprehensive plan changes we made, land development regulations we made, other things in those areas, where the time frames under the Senate Bill 170, because we would have to immediately stay the ordinance while someone challenged it, as the court went through and made a determination about whether in fact it was unreasonable or arbitrary or already preempted to the state. And the time frames for the court don't match up well with the time frames for completing a comp plan amendment change. So it would basically put us in a place where anyone in the community could stop any comp plan change simply by filing a lawsuit.
And that anyone in the community is important to note, because we're not just talking about a business, challenging an ordinance. It could be an environmental group deciding to challenge an ordinance. It could be a mom and pop store challenging a zoning change for the construction of a big box store. So there were several different, interactions, if you will, between who could have been impacting local development.
And today, under current law, those that can challenge comprehensive plan changes they have to be an affected party, and it's basically limited to consistency with the plan, not whether it's arbitrary or unreasonable. So this was opening up a door that ultimately the legislature decided they did not want to open once we informed them on what it could do. So ultimately that was pulled out. Additionally, on the business impact part of the bill, it was narrowed, so we only have to do a business impact now on comprehensive plan amendments that we initiate or land development regulations that the local government initiates as well.
Moving along, another bill that we see probably every year for the last dozen or so years. This is on vacation rentals, Senate Bill 280. And this year, the Senate took the lead, as they did the year prior, in moving this bill along. It ultimately did get across the finish line. Bob, can you let us know some of the details? I know some counties have some sort of grandfathering. It does preempt the regulation of the platforms to the state. What else is included in that bill this year?
There's a number of provisions in the bill. As Jeff said, it does preempt the regulation of the platforms to the state. That will affect, at a minimum, Miami-Dade County, who regulates that today. It also did require that where a platform collects the money, they have to collect and remit the taxes, and it provides that all local governments that self-administer the tax, tourist development taxes, are required to allow platforms to register as opposed to simply the vacation rentals themselves. It did put in place a provision that says that any of the ordinances that were adopted before 2011, first, it maintained that grandfather, and second, it put in a provision that said that they can be amended to be less restrictive. It did allow for reasonable fees for registration. It did authorize local governments to have a registration program. It specified certain things that could be included in the registration, such things as identifying information about the owner and operator of the vacation rental, the designation and maintenance at all times of responsible contact who would be available 24 hours a day, proof of license issued by Department of Business and Professional Regulation, and proof of all necessary tax registrations, payment in full on all outstanding liens. And it did specify that there would be a maximum occupancy of not more than 2 persons per bedroom and 2 additional persons for common areas. There is an exception to that if the rooms are over a certain size. I'd suggest reviewing the legislation for that. Now, it says that with respect to these registration requirements, they do not apply to any county that adopted an ordinance prior to January 1, 2016. And finally, it does allow for the suspension of the license if certain conditions occur.
And this is a bill that certainly we're going to need to see it play out in the community. We're going to need feedback from you all. We don't know some of the particulars and how they're going to play out over time. So while it did pass this session, this might not be the end of seeing regulation in this area. So feedback.
And the rumors were rampant the last day, whether this one's going to get past the governor.
Right. So it still needs to be signed by the governor. All the bills that we've talked about so far have not been sent to the governor. So we'll keep moving. There were a number of other preemption bills that did pass this session. Preemptions on zoning for natural gas pipelines. That was included in HB 1645. There was the preemption on EV charging station regulation to the state. There was a preemption similar to Uber a few years ago on food delivery platforms. These are some of those one-offs that we see from year to year. There was a preemption on civilian oversight boards that a sheriff or a police chief has to initiate those civilian oversight boards for law enforcement oversight or correctional officer oversight. And
Didn't that bill also include pay raises for sheriffs for the second time in 3 years?
Yeah, and that amendment was tucked in there on the floor. And then lastly, the bill dealing with the demolition of unsafe structures. This is being a coastal issue where it preempts the ability for a local government to determine what an unsafe structure for demolition, and they're able to build up to a higher standard of the building code. We're talking about older structures that may have been dilapidated through a hurricane. A lot of preservation historic groups from across the state gave a lot of feedback on those bills. But let's try to take the temperature down. I know we were going through those preemptions and we got a little worked up here, but we're going to move over to some growth management bills that were this session.
All right, Jeff, tell us about building permits. We had a lot of activity take place with respect to that bill. A lot of action both on the House and Senate side, a lot of negotiation going back and forth with the sponsors, Representative Esposito and Senator DeSigley. Tell us where it ended up.
Yeah, and this is House Bill 267, and this year it did pass. It was a bill that we worked with the sponsors the last few years, and it's dealing with the shot clocks for building permit review and trying to expedite or shorten some of those shot clocks to allow for development to occur more quickly. And so the process for approving with conditions or denying a permit, those shot clocks were reduced. However, there's a new back and forth process where a local government has more flexibility in identifying what types of information and the requests for information, how that process will work, that curing period at the end. So when the shot clock expires, there will be a 10-day window. The local government has to let the applicant know which aspects of the permit are insufficient to the code. Then the applicant has 10 days to respond to correct those issues in the code. But then the local government will have 10 final days to approve or deny the permit. The goal here was really to improve the customer service relationship between an applicant and the building department, knowing that you don't want to be setting a trap for a building official to fall into, like you didn't cross your T or dot your I. And we want to be able to work with our applicants because ultimately development in the community is helpful. And at the same time, knowing that if a lot of permit applications are submitted all at once, that could be a burden on our building departments. The bill also provides a new use of carry forward funds specific for the hardware and software and technology. And why that's so important is that as we have these compressed timelines and as technology changes, like artificial intelligence, AI permitting, there will be an ability for a local government and its building officials to more quickly assess those applications. These new AI things are able to look at a permit, see what's wrong, match it up to something in the past. This is something that's going to be growing over time and at a rapid pace. The bill also has numerous changes throughout Chapter 553, the Building Code statute, dealing with private provider reviews, private provider audits in building permits reviews. So that's going to be one you'll definitely want to look through our final report and all the details, talk to your building officials, but utilize the aspects in this bill that can empower the building department to be more efficient.
And Jeff, well, the final bill does have some shorter timeframes our folks are going to have to respond to. Weren't there some really damaging things in early versions of the bill? Things where if we didn't act quickly enough, permits would be deemed approved?
That's exactly right. So initially this bill, and as it was filed last year, said that if we didn't meet a time frame, it would be deemed approved. Instead of the normal, there would be a reduction in the permit fee per day. While those reductions in permit fees still exist, there's no longer any of this language about deemed approved. So permits being issued and be allowed to be constructed without being sufficient to the code won't occur. So delays for builders won't happen because they were deemed approved from a timeline. So that aspect of not having that deemed approved language was essential in making sure that this bill got across the finish line.
And this was not the only bill that affected the permitting and building development process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Senate Bill 812. This is the bill dealing with expedite permitting of residential building permits. It's the advanced community construction. We're talking about residential development, large-scale projects. And what the concept here in this bill is that for counties that are over 75,000 in population, they will need to establish a program with a two-step process for issuing first a preliminary plat and finally a final plat. And the reason that the proponents of this legislation wanted to speed up that window it takes to get the final plat and allow for a developer to begin the process of getting a building permit and beginning construction. So this interim period of getting a administrative plat, the administrative process of receiving a final plat, what this bill will say is that the builder can get up to 50% of the building permits within their residential community. So if we're talking about a subdivision with 200 homes or so, they are able to get up to 50% of those permits and begin that process of building the homes with restrictions. And the restrictions are important because the developer is not able to sell the property until the issuance of a final plat. There are performance bond requirements for the facilities, the infrastructure that are going to be going in these communities. There are requirements for indemnification for the local government, that the local government cannot be held liable for some of the impacts. They have to notify the utility of where these properties are going to be going.
And while this is going to be new ground for some counties, don't we have some counties that already have existing programs in place?
Yeah, that's right, Bob. And making sure when we work with folks on bills, if there's a program out there, this exists in a few counties, some larger cities, in wanting to expedite growth, we have to figure out ways to make bills work. So, we worked with these proponents of the legislation to make sure that this legislation can work at the local level. There's clearly going to be more questions as it relates to this process and how to tweak it at the local level. There are vested rights provided for the developer for the issuance of a preliminary plat, but those cease when they get to the final plat. And just continuing our growth management, session here. Another bill that we worked on the last few years dealing with mobility fees. This is House Bill 479, Alternative Mobility Funding Systems. It did pass this year. Bob is going to tell us more, but really where this bill started and where this bill finished couldn't be worlds apart.
The name on the bill remained the same, but most of the rest changed in the bill. And this all happened after the final committee hearing in the House. That was where we've been working on this bill for 3 years. There was a fence around it, and we were finally able to penetrate it following testimony in both the House and the Senate, and get the cities, the sponsor, the home builders to negotiate with us. Where the bill ended up is that where both a city and a county have imposed a fee, whether it be a mobility fee or an impact fee, for transportation impacts to the same development, then they have to have an interlocal agreement. The entity that issues the building permit collects the fee. It's very important. That's different than the early version where they were the only one who could charge a fee. They're set up to collect the fee unless the interlocal agreement specifies otherwise. Any local government in this situation where they're both, the city and the county, are imposing a fee, and if they have an interlocal agreement in place already, they are exempted out of the law. Miami-Dade County is also exempted out of the law, given their situation with their charter and the relationship with their cities. Before the bill was amended, the way it was in the last 3 years, we calculated it was somewhere 900 to 1,200 interlocal agreements that would have to be entered into, because there was a requirement for any city, any county, city to city interlocal agreements, city to county, county to county. And
that had FAC staff here up until the late hours of the night drawing different county maps, mapping out roadways to really understand how the relationships between those city to city, county to county relationships would interplay. And yeah, I think 1,200 is probably a rough estimate, right?
And now with the amended version of the bill, we expect it to be about 40 jurisdictions at a maximum, and it may be well lower than that are required to enter interlocal agreements. And there are penalties in the bill if the interlocal agreement is not, if one of the entities refuses to enter into an interlocal agreement.
So that one did get across. Again, House Bill 479 on mobility fees.
Jeff, as we move next into the area of agriculture and rural affairs, what happened in that area?
Sure, Bob. We're going to talk about Senate Bill 1082. Again, another bill that took a couple years to get across the finish line, dealing with housing for agricultural workers. This is a concept and bill that the ag community has been pushing to lift up ag and work with counties in approving housing for agricultural workers on a bona fide farm with some parameters, and those parameters are very important. So what was included in this bill are certain setback, buffer requirements, square footage caps. So for this process, it does say that that the ag housing does have to be up to federal standards for migrant farm worker housing. They have to follow state DOH standards. They have to follow local building codes. However, they are able to permit those on ag property. And we had another bill that we were drawing pictures with curtilage involved in trying to, put in setback and buffer requirements. So ultimately, for there to be a 2,500 square foot property for ag housing, it would need to be on a 10-acre farm. What comes out in this bill is there's a cap of 32,000 square feet of air-conditioned housing. Again, the acreage requirement to get to that maximum of 32,000 would be roughly 55 to maybe 60 acres. So there are some parameters of these industrial farms to provide the housing, so they're not popping up in other residential areas. There are, I will say, there are stricter setback requirements when it is residential. They have to put in berms or other fences to separate from another property. So again, the requirements that are in this bill for ag housing are there to help lift up that industry. And still in ag and rural, another one we were following is on rural hospitals. Bob.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes. Senate Bill 644 dealing with rural hospitals also passed. This bill designates rural emergency hospitals. It was passed in response to recent closure of a number of rural hospitals. It's designed to allow them to receive a certification where then they'll become eligible for future Medicaid and private insurance dollars as well. Does not provide They cannot provide inpatient service with the exception of a distinctly licensed skilled nursing unit to furnish post-hospital extended cares. They have to have a 24-hour emergency room available and staffed 24/7, and they have to have 50 or fewer beds.
Great, and I think that provides a great segue into our next moving from hospitals into health, safety, and justice. One bill in particular, 1567, dealing with emergency management qualification, emergency management director qualifications. Bob, you want to kind of walk through? I know we worked with a broad coalition with FEPA, with Florida Department of Emergency Management itself, with our small counties, in making sure that there weren't too high of a standard or a bar for emergency management directors.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. The first, FEPA is the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association. We worked with them. They worked with a sponsor. Originally, the bill would require that all emergency management directors be required to have a 4-year degree. They ended up modifying that to put in certain requirements that for the emergency management directors, they could have a series of training and experience that would allow them to not have to have the bachelor's degree. They had to have additional training necessary or other experience. They also had to be supervised at least one natural disaster. And then
and the bill really gives options. So
yes,
it's a bachelor's degree or other management experience. And earlier iterations of the bill required that bachelor's degree, which could have been an inhibitor for some of the smallest counties to attract and retain the talent that they need when a storm strikes. So,
and they did put in a period. They have up until I think it's July 2026 in order to be able to meet the new requirements in the statute.
And the next segment we're going to talk about is finance, tax, and administration. Every year there's a tax package, and every year there are a number of sales tax holidays and a number of other tax provisions that impact businesses, local government, ad valorem, sales tax. But first, we want to talk about the big one that was initially included, but ultimately didn't get into the tax package. Bob, that was dealing with TDT and discretionary sales taxes. Can you talk about that one?
Yes. The House tax package, as it came out of Ways and Means and then ultimately passed the House floor, included provisions that would have repealed all tourist development taxes every 6 years and required them to be reauthorized. They had a similar provision for all local option sales taxes that they also would be repealed, in this instance every 10 years, and then have to be reauthorized. Those provisions had extreme impacts on our ability, particularly for local option sales taxes, to bond those dollars and provide infrastructure to our communities, and thankfully the Senate did not pick those provisions up. There were other provisions in the tax bill. One that was very important for local governments related to property tax was an addition of a opt-out to what was referred to as the missing middle property tax exemption passed as part of the Live Local Act last session. This is a very narrow provision, but does allow communities that can demonstrate using data in what's referred to as a Schimberg report on affordable housing, statutorily required report, and if the local government can demonstrate that their housing situation stock is greater than the number of renters demanding that 0 to 120 AMI range, then they can opt out with a supermajority vote, 2/3 vote of the governing body. The opt-out is only good for 2 years. They can renew it every 2 years. The option doesn't come in until 2025, so something that's important to understand is that any development that gets that exemption this year gets to get it throughout the life of the exemption. And similarly in the future, if a local government were to adopt that exemption and then have a gap period, anyone who came in and qualified it would be able to continue to receiving it even if the local government passed an opt-out in the future.
So thankfully this year in this process, those TDT and the referendum repeal, when it goes into the void and we think that the sponsor is telling us it's not going to be in the final product, we have to trust all the efforts that you all had in notifying your senators, your representatives, the impact that could have had at the local level. We appreciate all of that, because then when it came out of conference or at the end of session in this final amendment, those provisions were not ultimately included. Also this year, there were bills dealing with the homestead exemption increase. Bob, do you want to talk about the bill that didn't pass first and then talk about the others?
Sure. The House Ways and Means heard 2 different constitutional amendments. One that would have, on the same committee meeting, one that would have doubled the second homestead exemption, the amount that exempts value between $50,000 and $75,000 and only applies to non-school levies. That would have doubled that to a $50,000 exemption. That one did not pass. Instead, what the House passed and then the Senate also ultimately concurred in was a proposed constitutional amendment that will instead index that second $25,000 exemption to inflation. It will go up starting January 1, 2025 in any year where the CPI is positive. If the CPI is negative, then that exemption amount would stay the same. Very dramatically different impact than the other bill. And there was also an implementing bill they put in place that specified in it an offset for fiscally constrained counties.
And of course, those bills, the implementing bill or this bill, would only go into effect if 60% of the voters, as it is a constitutional amendment, approve of it on the November ballot. So again, we'll see where those bills come this fall. Also, another budget item, dealing with the Florida retirement system, House Bill 151 on the cost of living adjustment, something that we've tracked the last couple of years that the Florida House has wanted to include as part of budget negotiations that has a pretty monster impact.
Yes, the fiscal on that was just shy of $1 billion. I think it was $927 million for counties. Ultimately, this would have restored a 3% cost of living adjustment for all state employees, members of the and county employees, members of the Florida retirement system. Ultimately, that did not pass. They had very minimal benefit changes, very small change on when reemployment could occur following drop. And the bill does also include the actuarially sound normal rates and unfunded liability rates. There are very little change from last year's rates because of very little changes in the law. And those rates are available in our budget write-up, which is also, you can link from factpolicy.com.
Great, Bob. And I know, obviously, some of these bills that passed, but you were pretty busy knocking down a few bills, too. You want to talk about millage rates first and kind of do a speed round here?
Sure, I'll go through them quickly. First bill was millage rates. We already have a requirement that we need a 2/3 vote to go in accordance with max millage requirements that are specified off the rollback rate. This would have put in an additional cap of the prior year millage rate, where if we adopted a local government adopted a rate above the prior year rate, they would also have to take a 2/3 vote. A couple other bills that...
TPP?
Yes, absolutely. There were constitutional amendments on both sides. The House had a version for tangible personal property. The Senate had their own version. Tangible personal property is subject to ad valorem millage, just like real property. And what the Senate version was to exempt all agricultural tangible personal property. On the House side, they looked at a much more broad-based provision that would have laid out, it would have doubled the existing $25,000 exemption on tangible personal property to $50,000. But neither of those bills ultimately passed the floor. They passed each other and died in each other's chamber.
Like many bills do throughout session. Another one that you worked on, fees for virtual offices. What is that?
No one was really sure, but it made its way fairly substantial distance in the House process, was never heard in the Senate. It would have preempted all local government fees on virtual offices, but that bill did not pass.
And then on TDT, there was another bill dealing with municipal share, particular to Miami-Dade. Is that right?
Yes, and that bill would have required Miami-Dade County to share some of its tourist development tax with some of its cities. There was a lot of concern that that was a camel's nose type situation, starting Miami-Dade and spreading elsewhere. Ultimately, that bill did not pass.
Moving into our next segment, water and environment. This is another big year for water and environmental bills. Some that we want to highlight, one dealing with the Clean Waterways Act, the state stormwater rule. This bill, Senate Bill 7040, did get across the finish line. It had failed to pass the year prior, and what this was, over the years, from that passage of the Clean Waterways Act, the Department of Environmental Protection worked with stakeholders through the Technical Advisory Committee that had a lot of local input on what the state updated stormwater rule would be. This rule this year did go through a number of changes from the rule that had been published, but ultimately was passed and ratified. It does have a regulatory impact over $1 billion, but this is something that the do nothing alternative was even greater on. So we're thankful that the stormwater rule got passed this session.
Great job on that one. How about, were there any bills affecting beaches?
Yeah, some that passed and some that failed. Public bathing spaces and beach water sampling. This is requiring local notification in your parks that have swimming, or beaches where you when their water is contaminated, if it's bacteria in the water, poopy water out there, that you have to put up signage coordinating with your local health department and DEP to make sure that signage to alert folks that the water might not be safe to swim in at that time. That was House Bill 165. But then a preemption bill that we defeated, House Bill 1079, coastal construction and assessments, looked like a benign bill. It was trying to provide saltwater intrusion assessments as a use for the Resilient Florida grants, but there was a preemption tucked in there that could have had sweeping implications to the coastal construction control line and coastal zoning and local building codes in coastal areas. So thankfully, us and other stakeholders worked on that to alert the legislature of what that the impacts could have been. We had bills, like the department. Yeah, sure, Beth.
My understanding on that bill, we had to search that preemption out. Is that fair?
Yeah, it was fair. The proponents thought it only impacted one jurisdiction. It might have impacted all 67. We were really not sure. 67 counties and many cities within those counties. The Department of Environmental Protection had their bill, House Bill 1557. It has a number of provisions impacting local government that you'll want to check out. They will create a water quality dashboard. DEP is going to be required to adopt rules to implement a septic and sewer general permit program to expedite permitting. It expands the types of projects that are available for Resilient Florida, and it clarifies the transfer of the septic and sewer program that's still underway from DOH to DEP. So be sure to check our report on all those details. And also, there was Senate Bill 1532, expanding the water quality enhancement credit program so that private entities could apply to participate in that program. And then bills like side slope reform, environmental management, that didn't get across the finish line. So it was a busy year, and as we discussed earlier, on the funding side for water. Moving to our last silo, community and urban affairs. We kind of already talked about some of the growth management issues, but we do want to highlight a bill, House Bill 1365, dealing with public sleeping and public camping, that took up a number of committee time, understanding what this bill is, what this bill isn't. Bob, do you want to kind of fill us in some of these details on this bill and give us some of the politics behind the bill too?
Sure. First, starting out, this bill was Speaker Designate Garrison's bill, also backed by the governor. Some of the background on this bill: anyone who's traveled out to the West Coast has seen that certain large cities have been challenged by their homeless population taking up residence in public areas, public spaces, living in tents, really creating tent cities. And so the politics behind this, the policy behind it, is trying to say, we don't want to head in that direction in Florida.
Right.
And we're going to get in front of it rather than have to deal with it once it's presented itself. And so what the bill does is, the first thing it does is it specifies that local governments cannot permit or otherwise allow, authorize or otherwise allow public camping and sleeping. The bill did not in its earlier versions, but in a later version, did define what public camping and sleeping means.
And it doesn't mean recreational sleeping in parks. It doesn't mean sleeping in your car.
It doesn't mean sleeping in your car. It means essentially in a public place, having a tent, residing in a tent, having your personal belongings, or sleeping without a tent in a public space. It does create an option. First, we can't allow that. Second, it creates an option that we can designate an area. We can designate an area in the county, or work with the municipality. We can designate an area within a municipality where we can allow public camping and sleeping. There's certain requirements that must be met, requirements for public sanitation, clean water, behavioral health services, some wraparound services for the folks there. There has to be security for both the property and the people there. And there has to be no drug use, no alcohol use at the facilities. And they are limited to 1 year in one location.
So there are a number of parameters that are included in this bill, but I think more importantly, we're going to have to see how this bill is implemented over time. You know, the relationship between the county and the city, with the sheriff, the police chief, the safety net, you know, with the continuum of care. You know,
a couple of the areas where we were able to gain some traction on the bill was pushing back its implementation to January, getting language in there that makes it clear that we're responsible to the limits of our authority, recognizing that the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer, and we cannot compel them as the governing body to take certain actions with respect to public safety, and then a commitment that as we go through implementation, where there are issues, we can bring them back. So I think it's very important for everyone, as you're considering how to operate in this new world, make a list. Any challenges, problems, if you see cities backing away from things they're doing today, it's very important that those things all get documented, we come to understand them, and that we can carry that message back to the leadership of the House.
And I think that's perfect, because this is a living, breathing process. While, you know, we have a bill that is heading to the governor's desk right now.
He's already has it.
Already has it. You know, it has 15, 14 days at this point to act on the bill. It's important that this is a process that it continues. So this is the first iteration for this bill.
Particularly since the back end consequence is this. The other thing the bill does is it grants a civil right of action to any citizen if they feel the local government is authorizing or otherwise allowing public camping and sleeping, in contrast to the requirements of the bill.
And the last bill, but certainly not least, is Senate Bill 328 on affordable housing. This is the Live Local Part 2, or enhancements, or glitch bill, however you want to look at it. It's got a number of provisions, you know, things that are lean in our favor at the county level, things that lean more for developers. Bob, can you tell us some of those highlights in the bill? I know there are a lot of provisions and it's impossible to go through them all, but some of those highlights?
Sure. One of the things that sort of bent away from us, as Jeff said, some things bent towards us, some things bent away. One of the things that bent away from us was where previously, last year's bill, we were preempted on density and height. This year they added floor area ratio. And so we cannot restrict the floor area ratio below 150% of the largest, highest, whatever the right word is for floor area ratio, otherwise allowed within the county. A couple of provisions that bent back towards us, they did put in place a provision, sort of think of it as an adjacent property restriction, where a proposed development is going to be adjacent to single-family residential on two sides, and the residential consists of at least 25 units, the local government can restrict the height of that development. And the options for the restrictions of the height is 150% of any of the adjacent properties to that development, the authorized height in that area, or 3 stories, whichever is higher. And then there were a couple other provisions that benefited us. There was a provision put in that if military bases, if the proposed development is within a quarter mile of a military installation, then it cannot be approved administratively. And if there's a provision for airport affected properties as well. So if the development's going to be close to an airport, there's special provisions there for airport affected areas.
Thank you, Bob. And we want to cover some of the bills in Community and Urban Affairs that didn't pass this year. We talked about throughout session the MPO reform bill that would have ranked MPOs, but then even given the DOT secretary the ability to take over at MPO. That bill failed. There was the annual growth management exercise on urban sprawl, changing definitions within Chapter 163. That bill didn't pass. There was a bill expediting development permit timelines. That failed. And a bill impacting DRIs. All of those bills didn't get across the finish line for one reason or another. Some of them may come back in another form next year. But some of these bills that did pass here towards the end of session, a bill on red light cameras or traffic enforcement devices, which also could be
it's school zones.
School zone.
They passed
cameras.
a bill a couple years ago that allowed cameras in school zones.
So it requires the enactment of an ordinance when you're using traffic infraction detectors. It requires that those devices do not use any parts or are manufactured in China, and requires an annual report on the use of red light cameras. There was a bill, the Department of Commerce's package, which is usually just an agency package, did have some tweaks to how we send our land development changes up to the state land planning agency for review, making sure that we get them in 10 days. But there was a provision, a late amendment tucked in there on a restriction for certain citizen-led charter amendments, requiring those to go back to the board for a vote before they go to a ballot. And then lastly, there's so many transportation bills titled transportation. We didn't know which one we were talking about, but there was the department's package that included the provision on the 20% of the administrative costs, a cap on administrative costs. And then there was House Bill 287, which had the 20% cap on using for transit dollars. Those two bills passed. Again, a lot of details in those bills. Be sure to look at them on our final report. And then our last bill that I wanted to just touch on was on cybersecurity. There was a cybersecurity incident liability bill this session that does provide some protection for local governments as long as they're substantially in compliance with the state standards adoption and some of those local grants. So be sure to look out for that bill. And last...
Wait, Jeff, before we go, you got to show me the money.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so this year's budget, it came in at roughly $117 billion, which is very similar to last year's budget, but the governor hasn't had his red pen yet. So we do expect it to be slightly lower than last year. There wasn't as much budget negotiation or back and forth between the chambers.
A lot of it was member project related.
A lot of member project related, but the chambers didn't have as many late night meetings in conference, not as many meetings over the weekends. It did come in, the budget was laid on the desk on time, which allowed for an early sine die. It was roughly like...
It's about 2 o'clock, which we haven't, but for us, it would have happened around noon.
Well, there you go. So again, we have our county funding highlights, check those out. A lot of county funding highlights provided, a lot of funding for the environment, for affordable housing, for the local cybersecurity grant. That has been maintained. Those dollars will be cared for. There was a minute there that we didn't think that was going to get across the finish line for cyber. Again, our whole report will have those details. Lastly, here are all the members of the FAC Public Policy team. Please give us a call, shoot us an email. We're always available to chat more. I know this was a major rundown very quickly with a lot of information. We really appreciate you sticking out to the end here. If you have those questions, please let us know how we can be of service to you. Bob?
And I just want to thank you, Jeff, for a great session, and thank you all for letting us represent you. It was a heck of a year. We came out about as clean as we could have hoped for.
And last, we sure hope to see you in Orlando, June 25th to the 28th at the Signia Bonnet Creek Hilton in Orange County. It's the same facility we were at last year, but you got to make sure that you book your hotel soon.
Get your rooms now. They're going fast.
So we look forward to seeing you all at our annual conference this summer. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.